mind don't make the trick, so you know we about to turn.
Good day, kings and queens, and we're back with another video. So again, as always, my videos tie into everything that I'm saying and doing. So again, like I was saying in previous videos about the immunizations of my kids and my son having a complication after one of them, and my nephew, which most didn't know, has autism. So hopefully I'll get to introduce him to you guys soon. But yeah, my sister has been researching for years what caused it. They've done a bunch of tests, of course, but the fact of the testing and the medical system and the immunizations, that's going to be the reason for these next few videos. So let's take a watch.
To the survivors, to the wives and family members, the children and the grandchildren, I say what you know. What the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry.
The Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the African American male, lasting from 1932 until 1972, was a violation of the rights of a vulnerable population by irresponsible medical professionals for the sake of medical knowledge. This deception harmed patients and their families for decades. However, the backlash from this study profoundly changed modern medical research. 82% of the Macon County population is African American, many living in dirt floor shacks without plumbing. Most have never seen a doctor in their lives and are illiterate.
The Public Health Service selected Macon County for a syphilis treatment program because over a third of the residents had the infection. Patients were treated with injections of heavy metals and mercury rubs, which was a standard therapy at the time. This treatment program lasted for 2 years.
When the treatment program ended, Dr. Tolliver Clark, the head of the Public Health Service, wished to continue with studies of syphilis, so he began a non-therapeutic human experiment called the Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. He envisioned a 6 to 8 month observational study of untreated latent syphilis, followed by a treatment program.
Syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease that, when untreated, appears in 4 stages. Stage 1 and 2 are characterized by rashes. The third stage is without symptoms and is called latent. The final stage is tertiary syphilis, which can cause severe injury to the heart, brain, and nerves, resulting in paralysis, blindness, or even death. The problems can appear any number of years after the patient is infected. The Tuskegee study focused on men who had latent and tertiary syphilis, and in 1930, no effective cure was known for syphilis.
The study was approved in 1932 by Alabama health officials under the condition that some sort of treatment would ultimately be provided.
Now, what you have to do is take this. Now, remember in my previous videos, I told you with everything that you're given, make a timeline. So add this to your timeline. They gave you the dates. Add this to your timeline and compare it with anything else that was going on at the same time. Anything else you possibly have documented facts about. I can guarantee you that it was just as it was from history. The reason why this was allowed is because the ones that owned the government were Caucasian. Let's continue.
Clark teamed up with the Tuskegee Institute, a local black university. Raymond A. Walter-LaHare, a physician who had worked on the earlier treatment program, began to recruit men. Essential to convincing the men was Eunice Rivers, an African-American nurse who accompanied Dr. Walter-LaHare as he traveled throughout the county. Field stations were created and hundreds were tested. To fulfill the treatment requirements, mercury rubs, injections, and pills were administered. The decision was made to add spinal taps to the study, an extremely painful procedure that provided no benefit to the men. It was performed purely for the sake of science. To encourage participation, a deceiving letter was sent to the subjects claiming, "This is your last chance for special free treatment." For the first time, the rights of the patients were clearly violated as the physicians lied to the patients. By the end of the first year, hundreds of men had been studied. Dr. Clark believed the experiment to be successfully completed and retired. Dr. Volter took over and proposed an ambitious 10-year study of 400 men with autopsies at their deaths to discover syphilis-induced damage on untreated men. To entice participants, he provided a sham treatment of aspirins and mercury compound. In reality, the study visits were conducted simply to confirm the men were still untreated. In 1933, they recruited 384 more men. Ironically, it was African-American Nurse Rivers who held this study together. Since the men trusted her, she could persuade them to sign autopsy agreements. In 1936, the first report was published, and the study was continued. Subjects remained uninformed to the study goals. Many didn't even know they had syphilis, as Southern doctors use the term bad blood for many diseases.
Now, if anyone knows the studies with medical and foods and our past or our original culture, you'll know that, okay, so I'm trying to explain this in the most layman's terms ever. You can't get any type of disease from anything other than what you put in your body. So it's essentially what you eat that gives you a cure. It's that simple. So when we weren't able to eat the original foods that we were supposed to, then we began eating certain things, and then we began getting diseases. So to say the least, just do your studies on viruses, diseases, and germs.
In addition, they thought they were receiving special free care. In 1943, Dr. John Heller took over the study. This same year, penicillin was proven effective in the treatment of early syphilis. 1948 marked the end of the Nuremberg trials of Nazi doctors involved in concentration camp experiments. The resulting Nuremberg Code was the first real set of rules for ethical medical research.
The thing that amazes me most about the Nuremberg Code is that it was totally ignored by Americans. I think we thought we could never do unethical research like the Nazis. And yet, at the very same time as the Nazis, and for 30 years after that, we did unethical research without consent on vulnerable minorities. It is without a doubt the Tuskegee doctors broke two bedrock principles of the Nuremberg Code that are medical ethics principles today. You must have consent. The risks of the trial must be proportional to the benefits. Tuskegee doctors violated both.
Ms. Connie St. Clair is a research nurse at National Jewish Health who conducts trials of medications for the treatment of cystic fibrosis.
Now, what I need you to understand, I'll do another video about, you need to understand the history of the U.S. medical system. So everything is going to go back to the beginning. Everything is going to go back. You can't study law, history, or any language, anything without going all the way back. So essentially, the studies became how to keep the Caucasians alive or from going extinct. That's what all the studies and sciences are about. It's how to keep the Caucasians alive. I will share some videos later. It's not me saying this. Well, it is me saying this, but I'm just sharing the facts. Let's continue to watch.
Patient can participate in a clinical trial. They must fully understand all aspects of the study and give informed consent. Some of the important parts of informed consent are that patients understand that they have the choice not to participate in a clinical trial. It is the doctor's ultimate responsibility that the patient fully understand what benefits, if any, they may receive from the study and what risks may be encountered.
The research coordinator verifies the patient truly understands the study. Hospitals and universities can lose all research funding if they fail to monitor their clinical trials. 1957 was the 25th year of the study, and 11 reports have been published. Each man received a certificate of participation and $1 for every year of service. Meanwhile, views of racism were changing. In 1954, Brown versus Board of Education banned school segregation, and the civil rights movement was growing. Outsiders began to question the study, and some of the men moved from Macon County and sought out penicillin as treatment. The Public Health Service decided to continue on, adding free hot meals and cash payments to the aspirin and iron tonics. Their answers to the racial issues was that advanced syphilis may not respond to treatment.
In 1966, Peter Buxton, who was working for the Public Health Service, found out from one of his colleagues that they were doing a study in Tuskegee and denying African American males treatment for syphilis. He was outraged. He immediately went to some of the top personnel in the Centers for Disease Control and was totally rebuffed.
Why do we need them to be outraged? And why do we need them to speak out for us when we were being mass murdered? Just to be guinea pigs so they could see how they could survive. What could make them last longer. What they could take from us so they could create them stronger.
He tried for years to get this through to them, and finally they just told him to stop pursuing this angle because the study was crucial for science and it would help future doctors treat syphilis.
In July 1972, he finally persuaded Associated Press reporter Gene Heller to break the story. It was titled, "Syphilis Victims in U.S. Study Went Untreated for 40 Years."
So when people say this is not true, that is a credible source. That is what you would say would be a credible source. Gene Heller and the publication of her newspaper when she made the report. That would be a credible source. So when someone says, "Oh, where did you get your information from?" "Oh, you're just watching YouTube videos." "Oh, you don't know what you're speaking of." Well, I mean, there's more, but, for those that need evidence or proof.
Began with the sentence, "For 40 years, the USPHS has conducted a study in which human beings with syphilis were induced to serve as guinea pigs." The next month, a mixed-race panel created by the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare declared the study ethically unjustified. They found that the doctors denied the rights of the patients by not providing informed consent. The study fell below adequate scientific standards, and treatment should have been provided when penicillin was invented. Remarkably, the Center for Disease Control continued to debate whether or not it was their duty to provide treatment to the men. In March 1973, Senator Ted Kennedy forced them to offer free treatment. By this point, the men had been alerted of the study flaws and hired civil rights lawyer Fred Gray. Gray opposed further free government treatment, fearing this would damage their case for compensation. Plus, most of the men no longer trusted the government to protect their health. Gray filed suit.
None of the men no longer trusted the government to protect their health. That's a mental issue. That's something wrong with them. They had a right to fight and stand up for what they knew and believed in. So, am I doing the same thing, or is what I'm going through different? When they want to force vaccinations, what they're calling vaccinations, into my kids. Other than that, they wouldn't be conversing with me.
In July 1973, asking for $3 million for each man or his heirs. He focused both on presenting the case in court and again to the public eye. However, Gray protected the African American doctors, Nurse Rivers, and the Tuskegee Institute by asserting they were also victims. The study began in a time of extreme racism and discrimination, and they were powerless to stopping the study. The case ended in 1974 with a settlement. Surviving men were entitled to $37,500, and the heirs of deceased patients received $15,000. All survivors and some of the families would also get continued free medical treatment. Hearings led by Senator Kennedy in response to the Tuskegee study resulted in the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects in Biomedical and Behavioral Research.
The commission created the Belmont Code, which summarizes the rights of the patient and the responsibility of the doctors. The Tuskegee study violated many principles of the Belmont Code, including informed consent of the patient, withholding treatment, putting men and their families at risk, flat-out deception, and the exploitation of a vulnerable group.
What the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry.
We have no idea how many wives, girlfriends, children inherited the disease and also died or were forever crippled by its effects.
For 40 years, the U.S. government operated public health service conducted what was known as the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, one of the darkest chapters in American history. Now, over 40 years after the study ended, we still don't know and might never know the full extent of its effects. And the study might have continued if not for a 1972 article from Associated Press reporter Jean Heller.
Everyone who knew about this, to my way of thinking, everyone who knew about this and didn't blow the whistle, that didn't shout to high heaven, "This is wrong," is culpable.
Syphilis was...
Now that lady there, she also was the one that exposed COINTELPRO. So again, I do not promote hate of any kind. I do share the facts. And the facts are that this was all done by Caucasian people. Not to say that it was all the Caucasian people that agreed with it, that wanted this to happen. I am not saying that. And there were a bunch that were abolitionists that assisted in what some would call the slave era, excuse me. And some that fight for us now. So again, it's not everyone, and it's not everyone of our kind that's good, that's gonna help us or anything like that. We must know the individual. We must know the individual. We must know the past so that if that situation is coming to us again, then we can see it. We can acknowledge it. We can stop it. The only reason why I've ever said that we need total separation is because we have attempted to unite, and it has never happened in the history of America since, I guess, since about Christopher Columbus days. Ever since they came over, it hasn't been equal. It's been them trying to prove that they're superior, which everyone knows they're not. No one is superior. We're just here. At least we're supposed to be just here. You are who you are. You just go about and you respect and you get respect. It's just that simple.
Considered a national health crisis in the early 20th century.
You don't know a thing about syphilis, except that you've got it.
And many doctors at the time thought syphilis and other medical complications were affected by race. To study the disease, researchers found a population of poor, black, syphilitic sharecroppers in and around Tuskegee, Alabama during the Great Depression. Nearly 400 of the participants had syphilis, while another 200, the control group, did not. In the end, as many as 100 men died from complications related to untreated syphilis, and the message was very clear. Black deaths mattered.
Medical doctors deliberately let them die. wanted them to die for what they could discover from their bodies later.
How old were you when you first learned about the Tuskegee study?
23.
The day you published this story, the day the story was published, did you know what was getting ready to happen?
Yeah. I knew it would be explosive. After the story broke, and there was this incredible public outcry, Senator Kennedy had held very, very public congressional hearings on this.
If they had been white, your public health service would never have agreed to do this study in the first place. They wouldn't have dared.
The study and the aftermath are well documented in films and books, but there are still things we might never know, and for Heller, that goes back to the very beginning.
I still have not heard the answer to the very simple question of why. They should have been able to determine after the first 3 or 4 autopsies that the inside of a black person ravaged by syphilis looks identical to the insides of a white person and stop the study.
Beyond that, Heller believes there's no way to know just how many people were directly or adjacently affected by the study or its disclosure. Survivors, victims of the study, and their families did win a $10 million settlement from the U.S. government, and the study's disclosure led to modern medical ethics procedures. But Heller says more than 40 years later, there's still at least one lesson to be learned from the Tuskegee syphilis study.
Those of us who recognize that this country has got so far to go, never quit fighting. Never quit standing up and yelling. I don't care if you're LGBT, I don't care if you're black, I don't care if you're disabled. You need advocates. You need people who can move the world.
Yes, I agree with her. And salute and kudos to her and to all the ones before us, all the ones that stood and fought. No matter their race, no matter their color, the ones that stood, the ones that fought for the rights, the ones that protected everyone, the ones that understood right was right and wrong was wrong. Salute to all of them. And now we're going to see a video about the U.S. medical system. So let's take a watch.
Of Central Park in Manhattan. There's a bronze statue of a doctor named James Marion Sims, whose brilliant achievement carried the fame of American.
Now go look up James Marion Sims. Google him, do some research. James Marion Sims.
Surgery throughout the entire world. He's the guy who created the vaginal speculum, an instrument gynecologists use for examination. He pioneered the surgical repair for fistula, a complication from childbirth, and became known as the father of modern gynecology. But that brilliant achievement was the result of a series of excruciating experimental surgeries that he conducted on enslaved women. In a lot of ways, Sims epitomizes the story of American medicine for Black women. It's a system that's failing them to this day. From infant mortality to life expectancy, the racial disparities in healthcare are staggering. The gulf between Black and white might be widest when we look at maternal mortality, with Black women 3 to 4 times more likely to die in connection with pregnancy or birth than white women. And that divide can be traced back to doctors like Sims, who contributed to a long, largely overlooked history of institutional racism in medicine.
Trying to understand a historical problem without knowing its history is like trying to treat a patient without eliciting a thorough medical history. You're doomed to failure.
That's Harriet Washington, a medical ethicist and author who chronicled the intersection of race and medicine in her book, Medical Apartheid. While many of the stark racial disparities in healthcare can be attributed to environmental and economic factors like access to good healthcare, studies show that minority patients tend to receive a lower quality of care than non-minorities, even when they have the same types of health insurance or the same ability to pay for care.
So that's proof that we receive less quality of healthcare. So why would we trust them to give us anything? Why would I trust them to put something into my kid's body? Why would I trust them to do anything with my body or my kids' bodies? Look at the history.
As African Americans, we've been abused for so long, consistently by the system. Why should we trust it? Why should we go to it when ill? And that's iatrophobia. That's a fear of the healer, inculcated by the behavior of those healers, unfortunately.
It starts with slavery. Doctors relied on slave owners for financial stability. They accompanied plantation masters to auctions to verify the fitness of slaves and were called in to treat sick slaves to protect their owners' investments. In 1807, Congress abolished the importation of slaves and in turn pushed Black women to have more children, to essentially breed slaves. Founding Father Thomas Jefferson later wrote, "I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man on the farm."
So this was supposed to be the founding father. Founding father? Okay, so let me get this straight. A racist Caucasian man is the founding father of the American lands, although they had to kill and rape the people that were already here. Okay, but we don't see why this is in today when they are trying to force immunizations in my kids. This was all built off of this right here. These people here. Even the medical system is racial. The law system, justice system, racial. The housing system, racial. Every institution, racial.
Around the 1830s, the abolitionist movement led to the rise of what was called Negro medicine, or efforts to identify Black inferiority to justify slavery. And there were polygenists who tried to use both science and the Bible to find proof that races evolved from different origins. The 1830s also marked the beginning of recorded experimentation on Black women's bodies. One doctor performed experimental C-sections on slaves. Another one perfected the dangerous ovariotomy, or removal of an ovary by testing the procedure on slave women. In fact, half the original articles in the 1836 Southern Medical and Surgical Journal dealt with experiments on Black people. And then, of course, there was James Marion Sims, whose reputation is etched in history and on that statue in Central Park. Between 1845 and 1849, Sims began performing experimental surgeries on a 17-year-old slave named Anarcha. He eventually performed 30 operations on Anarcha and more surgeries on about 11 other female slaves. When his male colleagues could no longer bear to assist him in inflicting pain on the women, the slaves took turns restraining one another. Yet paintings depicting Sims, Anarcha, and other slave women presented a subdued version of his experiments. Even though anesthesia was introduced in 1846, Sims chose not to use it for his experimentation with slaves. His practices echoed one of the most prevalent and dangerous beliefs in medicine at the time, that Black people did not feel pain or anxiety. This book from 1851, titled The Natural History of Human Species, claimed the American dark races bear with indifference tortures insupportable to a white man. Studies released as recently as last year demonstrate that Black people are less likely to be treated for pain, particularly in the ER. There's even one from a children's hospital that found the same to be true for kids. And just this year, Pearson Education, a leading educational publisher, issued an apology and recalled nursing textbooks that included racist stereotypes, like this section that said Black people often report higher pain intensity than other cultures.
Well, what does it mean when you say that someone doesn't feel pain? Among other things, you're speaking about their humanity. These are all part of that suite of beliefs emanating from the 19th century that we still have not shaken off. Despite all our knowledge and sophistication, they're deeply ingrained.
Doctors like Sims might fit the Dr. Frankenstein stereotype, but they weren't outliers. Historically, Southern doctors who used Black bodies for troubling experiments were the norm.
It's a very common question. How can we judge our forebears? You know, those guys in the 18th century who practiced medicine in a way that appalls us today. You know, we think, How could you do that? I did not judge the practitioners based on our own ethics. I judged them based on the ethics of their time. It was not acceptable back then. We just did not hear from the people who protested against it.
After the Civil War ended, the 1900s brought a wave of immigrants to the U.S. It sparked a race panic and coincided with the birth of the American eugenics movement. One of the movement's key objectives was to reduce the childbearing potential of the poor and disabled. Leaders included birth control pioneer and Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger, who eventually devised the controversial Negro Project, or family planning centers that pushed birth control in the Black South. It was a project that even garnered support from W.E.B. Du Bois, a founder of the NAACP, who wrote that Black people bred carelessly and disastrously. By the mid-1930s, more than half the states passed pro-sterilization laws, and often sterilization was forced. In 1961, future civil rights leader Fannie Lou Hamer went to the hospital to have a tumor removed, but was subjected to a hysterectomy without consent. The procedure, which rendered women infertile without their knowledge, was so common in the South that Hamer is said to have dubbed it the Mississippi appendectomy.
African American babies were no longer economically valuable. And African Americans themselves had gone from being a resource to a nuisance.
In June of 1973, the SPLC uncovered 100 to 150,000 cases of women who had been sterilized with federal funds in Alabama. Half the women...
Did you hear that number? How many women had been sterilized? Who gave these people permission to do this? All of these atrocities, all of this evil that they've been able to commit.
Men were Black. In recent decades, women of color continue to be exposed to dubious reproductive health programs. In December 1990, the FDA approved a contraceptive called Norplant, and it was selectively marketed to Black teenagers in Baltimore schools.
You know, one of the current birth control methods now in the United States is Norplant.
Norplant fans like David Duke, the former KKK Grand Wizard, even introduced legislation to give women on welfare an annual reward of $100 if they agreed to get Norplant.
And it's time we start to encourage welfare mothers to be responsible.
That bill never passed, but the implant ignited a debate on whether long-term contraception, like Norplant that lasted 5 years, could be used as a form of social engineering when pushed to specific communities. Today, as we continue to lose Black mothers at alarming rates, a deeper look at the past may be a good step towards creating a more equitable healthcare system. Hi guys, thanks for watching.
So the whole plan to this, again, is to attempt to exterminate us to the minorities, because we are not the minorities, so that they don't go extinct. So again, more videos to come. I'm hoping that everything is starting to tie together now. But yeah, thanks for watching.
I don't make the trick, so you know we got the turn.
Money, red.